Our story begins with Glenn, a lazy good-for-nothing idiot, who somehow just got hired as a substitute teacher in the most prestigious magic academy in the whole continent, despite even his resume having no care or thought put in it at all. And under work experience, this Chad just bluntly put none in my whole life, and he cares so little about his new job that he's already late on his first day. But while rushing towards the school, he accidentally bumps into two girls, who instantly send him flying away, and he lands right into a nearby fountain. But Glenn immediately just tries to play it cool, even as a frog leaps out of his mouth. And when Sistine then apologizes to him for pushing him into the fountain, Glenn immediately becomes smug and condescending, and says they'll need to repay him with their plot. But just then, Glenn begins to thoroughly inspect every inch of Rumia, and even examines up her uniform, since she looks familiar, and he wonders if perhaps they've shared a passionate night together, which once again results in Sistine launching him away. Later that day, Sistine and Rumia arrive in class and wait patiently with their classmates for the new teacher to arrive, who is already far too late. But after a few more minutes, Glenn enters the classroom, and upon seeing the girls' reactions, Glenn immediately denies being the guy from the fountain before they even accuse him of it. Meanwhile, Hallie, a fellow teacher at the academy, complains to the headmaster about how unqualified Glenn is to teach at the most prestigious academy in the land. However, the headmaster reminds him that Glenn was recommended by Celica, one of the most powerful and fearsome mages in the world, who actually forced Glenn to accept this job. Therefore, Glenn surely must be uniquely talented. And at that same moment, the students in his class watch in complete awe as Glenn writes something profound and inspirational on the chalkboard, which is soon revealed to be self-study as he takes a nap at his desk and tells the students to study by themselves. Meanwhile, Celica walks into the headmaster's office and threatens Hallie never to speak ill of Glenn again while in her presence, prompting Hallie to immediately apologize, before running away frightened. At that same time, Glenn teaches with such lack of enthusiasm that he looks completely dead inside, and writes with such lazy and sloppy handwriting that his students can't read a single thing he wrote, infuriating Sistine to the point where she can no longer remain polite, and scolds Glenn for being a worse teacher than a bag of rocks. But Glenn doesn't care at all, and as soon as the bell rings, he immediately bolts out of the classroom before any of his students. And later that day, Glenn accidentally barges in on the girls changing, but rather than beg for mercy, Glenn decides this is the perfect time to go off on a rant about how cliché this situation is, and how a man shouldn't have to avert his eyes from a beautiful woman's plot armor, so he'll burn this amazing view into his brain, before immediately being knocked out of the room. The next day in class, Glenn once again instructs the students to study on their own while he naps peacefully. But seeing Glenn snooze off at his desk again, Sistine can't stand it anymore and decides to intervene by threatening to tell her father about Glenn's incompetence, since her family is rich and powerful and has a lot of influence in the school, so Glenn will surely be fired as a result. Glenn is shocked to hear this, but rather than be frightened, he immediately grabs Sistine's hand and says he's eagerly awaiting her father's complaint, as that would finally free him from this hellhole of a job. Frustrated that nothing seems to be getting through to Glenn's thick skull, Sistine throws her glove at him as a challenge to a duel, which Glenn begrudgingly accepts, while warning her that if he wins, she'll have to do anything he wants, which immediately makes the other girls in class feel uneasy. Afterwards, Glenn announces that for this duel they'll only be allowed to use the Shock Bolt spell so that he doesn't accidentally kill Sistine. But since Shock Bolt is a spell that requires a long sentence to cast, Sistine thinks that Glenn must be confident that he can cast faster than her, which makes her incredibly anxious, and she contemplates apologizing to him. But upon remembering how condescending and unbearable Glenn is, she decides that she'd rather die than apologize to an ape in human clothes. Once the duel starts, however, everyone is shocked when Sistine actually casts Shock Bolt before Glenn, somehow winning the duel in a matter of seconds. And despite Glenn acting completely arrogant a moment ago, he gets back up and says the duel was actually a best of 3, before being zapped by Sistine once more. So he then gets back up again and says it's now a best of 5, and immediately gets zapped again, ending the duel swiftly, though Glenn claims it's a draw since he was just holding back from hurting Sistine, before immediately running away. Meanwhile, the students are completely shocked that their new teacher truly is this incompetent and stupid. The next day, Glenn continues his role as a wonderful teacher by once again instructing his students to study independently while he slacks off at his desk. But when Sistine dismissively mocks Glenn for being a lazy baboon who doesn't understand the importance of magic, Glenn immediately refutes her claims by condescendingly explaining how other things like science and agriculture are far more useful to humanity than magic, and mocks Sistine and the other students for wasting their time learning magic since its only real purpose is to wage wars and slaughter humans. Offended by these words, Sistine slaps Glenn, before running away in tears. Later that day, however, Glenn reflects on what he said to Sistine and realizes he went too far. And the next day, to everyone's surprise, Glenn apologizes to Sistine for mocking her beliefs, though he still believes he was right about magic. He then immediately negates this apology by nonchalantly calling his students idiots who don't understand the true meaning of magic, which of course just offends his students. But he proves this point by teaching them about Shock Bolt, a spell that the students consider far beneath their level, and the same spell Sistine clapped Glenn's cheeks with. However, when Glenn reveals that you can cast this spell by uttering a single word instead of a long sentence, or how changing the words can make the spell curve or go faster, the students are mind blown by Glenn's explanations as they realize that they truly understand nothing about magic, and Glenn's unparalleled genius becomes clear, while also making it clear that Glenn lost to Sistine simply because he was too lazy to put even an ounce of effort. And by breaking down how words affect incantations, and how incantations affect spells, Glenn is able to teach the students about the fundamental truths of how magic works, which they had never been exposed to before. And as time progresses, Glenn's lessons become famous around school for being easy to follow yet profound in depth, and even students from other classes end up sneaking into his class just to hear his lectures. Meanwhile, Celica celebrates Glenn's newfound fame and success, as she knew all along that he would make a great teacher since he was her most admirable apprentice, which just frustrates Hallie even more, who has Glenn living rent-free in his head at this point. Sometime later, Celica approaches Glenn after school and informs him that everyone except Glenn's class will be going on a field trip tomorrow, and warns him not to get into trouble again with any of the girls, and to come to her instead if he wants his needs satisfied properly. The next day, Glenn proves himself to be a responsible teacher as he's once again late for work. But while rushing to the academy, he suddenly senses the presence of a hidden assassin, who is impressed that a lowly substitute teacher was able to detect him. Meanwhile, dangerous men infiltrate Glenn's class searching for Rumia while threatening to kill anyone who interferes with their plan. But when Sistine stands up for her and is nearly killed by military-grade magic, Rumia reveals herself to protect her classmates, and allows the men to take her away by force as they reveal that they know that her real identity is Princess Hermione, daughter of Queen Alicia. Meanwhile, one of the thugs takes Sistine to an empty room as he needs her help to write a novel full of plot, or something like that. Just then, however, Glenn enters the room and finds the thug on top of Sistine, and immediately offers to give them some privacy instead of helping, just to annoy Sistine. But when the thug then tries to use his magic on Glenn, it is automatically dispelled, as Glenn reveals his Uno Stop card, known as Fool's Arcana, a card embedded with genius levels of magical code that Glenn designed and created himself, which shuts down all magic within a set radius around him. And upon seeing this, Sistine is in complete awe of Glenn's otherworldly genius. But just then, Glenn reveals that of course this means his spells don't work either, making his Fool's Arcana completely useless. But as the thug laughs at Glenn for disabling both their magic, he's immediately force-fed a can of whoop-ass as Glenn unleashes upon him a beating more severe than when I get bad grades, which the thug recognizes as military martial arts, taught only to the most elite special ops forces. Glenn then finishes him off with his super magical punch, which is actually just a kick, but according to Glenn that's the part that makes it magical. Shortly after, Glenn contacts Celica to inform her that intruders have infiltrated the school and taken some of the students hostage, while also telling her that this attack is the work of the Divine Wisdom Organization, which Celica recognizes as a deeply evil group, and informs Glenn that he has no choice but to continue fighting alone. Suddenly, a dark portal opens in the middle of the room, and skeleton creatures known as bone golems begin crawling through it. Glenn remains unfazed by this, however, and instructs Sistine to perform an advanced wind spell to immobilize the bone golems. And thanks to Glenn's encouragement to give it her all, she successfully manages to cast the powerful spell. Meanwhile, Glenn channels a powerful spell of his own, and unleashes his execution ray upon the bone golems, decimating them in an instant, along with part of the school. Unfortunately, however, Glenn's mana is completely drained by this and is left looking pale and gray as if near death. And to make matters worse, an Uchiha-looking-ass guy suddenly arrives to destroy to destroy Glenn, as he reveals that he already knows that Glenn's Fool Arcana won't work on his magical blades. But upon seeing these blades, Glenn just smugly responds that his opponent must be overcompensating for something. However, realizing that this guy is more powerful than the last, Glenn whispers something to Sistine before pushing her to safety, and then tries to fight off against the infiltrator all on his own. But he quickly finds himself overwhelmed by his opponent's magical blades. But Glenn's resilience and impressive skills garner respect for him from his opponent, who is surprised by Glenn's deep knowledge of military tactics. He then goes in for the finishing blow, while Glenn surprisingly allows the blades to pierce him, as a distraction for Sistine to cast magic to dispel the blades, which Glenn had planned from the moment he pushed her off. He then immediately leaps forward with his opponent's own blade, and stabs him through the stomach. And as the man takes his final breath, he suddenly remembers having heard rumors of a legendary mage killer codenamed the Fool, who was considered the most skillful and fearsome assassin. Afterwards, a completely exhausted Glenn falls to his knees, but as he loses consciousness, he thinks back to his blood-filled past, and how foolish he was to once believe he could be a mage of justice. Just then, Glenn regains consciousness and realizes that Sistine bravely transferred some of her mana to him. And without a moment to waste, Glenn quickly heads out to find Rumia. He arrives moments later where Rumia is held captive, and finds that the mastermind behind all this is none other than Huey, the professor Glenn was hired to replace. However, Huey remains calm and friendly as he explains that Rumia is crucial to the Divine Wisdom's plans, and that he's trapped her within multiple magical circles that will soon teleport her away, while Huey will stay back to blow up the entire school by turning his body into a mana explosion. However, Glenn is determined not to let anything happen to his students and bites himself so he can write in his blood, even though he's already bleeding from just about every part of his body. Glenn then writes incantations in his blood, freeing Rumia from one magical circle at a time, but draining Glenn's mana more and more as he continues, quickly inching him closer to death's door, but still refusing to give up despite Rumia's pleas to do so. But before he can destroy the last magical circle, Glenn apologizes to Rumia for failing her and promptly passes out. Seeing all the effort Glenn has put in inspires Rumia to do her best as well, as she reaches her hand through the barrier despite the intense pain, and places her hand on Glenn's head. At that moment, Glenn regains consciousness as he is imbued with Rumia's mana, which he now realizes is an incredibly rare white mana that amplifies the powers of anyone touched by it. And with renewed strength, Glenn destroys the final magic circle, saving the day in a blindingly powerful burst of magical energy. And after Glenn saves Rumia and all the other students, Celica finally returns to the school, and thanks Glenn for his hard work. In response, however, Glenn smugly says that he just saved the school because it's a convenient place for his naps. A few days later, Sistine and Rumia announce that the Academy is organizing a series of competitions, while their classmates are completely unenthusiastic since they consider themselves inferior to students from other classes and don't believe they have any chance of winning. But suddenly, Glenn strides into the classroom and immediately starts cheering up his pessimistic students by confidently asserting that they can definitely win the competition, which immediately motivates them to give it their all. But while Rumia and Sistine believe that Glenn is finally embracing his role as a teacher, in reality, earlier that day Glenn had begged the headmaster for an advance on his salary since he's completely broke. However, the headmaster of course refused and instead told Glenn that instructors who lead their class to victory in the upcoming competition will receive a large bonus, which immediately got him scheming. The next day, Glenn takes his students to the training field to practice for the competition, when he suddenly encounters Hallie, who he mockingly refers to as Harem. Annoyed by Glenn's unprofessional behavior, Hallie immediately tells Glenn that he's wasting his time by including all his students in the competition, rather than focusing only on the most talented ones, which makes Glenn feel like an idiot since he hadn't thought of that at all. Wanting to take Hallie down a notch, however, Glenn challenges him to a bet in which the loser of the competition must forfeit 3 months' worth of salary, which Hallie confidently agrees to, while Glenn once again feels like an idiot for acting without thinking. Meanwhile, his students are inspired and motivated by how much faith Glenn seemingly has in them. And as days pass, Glenn diligently practices with his students by pushing them to refine their techniques, while trying to fight off his ever-growing starvation. When the day of the competition finally arrives, Queen Alicia, who is secretly Rumia's biological mother, heads to the city eager to secretly watch her daughter compete. And as the competition begins, students of Glenn's class take turns showcasing their skills in various events, and Glenn is actually shocked by just how well his students are actually performing, but confidently pretends as though this was all part of his master plan. When it's then Rumia's turn to compete in a mental defense competition, she feels immense pressure not to let her classmates down since they've been trying their best all day. But she manages to remain calm and focused, even when the creepy teacher leading the test, who's enjoying this way too much, desperately tries to break Rumia's mental for his own twisted pleasure. But despite her resolve never wavering, during the final test, the teacher's attack completely overwhelms Rumia and she suddenly collapses to her knees. Upon seeing this, Glenn approaches her and immediately congratulates her on her tremendous effort, but suggests she withdraw as it's too dangerous to continue. But to everyone's surprise, when Rumia's opponent is announced as the winner, he remains unconscious while standing. And it immediately becomes clear that Rumia is actually the winner, as she was the only one able to withstand the attack, shifting the crowd's reaction from shock to admiration for Rumia's tenacity and strength. Meanwhile, Queen Alicia is satisfied to have watched her daughter perform from afar, but still longs for more and desperately wishes she could see Rumia face to face once more. At that same time, Albert and Riel, two elite assassins, watch from afar and recognize Glenn as their former comrade who suddenly vanished without a word from the Imperial Army's Special Ops Forces. And although Riel wishes to have a word with Glenn, Albert reminds her that their mission is to protect the Queen from a potential traitor in her ranks. Meanwhile, Glenn uses magic to transform into Rumia to help prepare one of his students for her upcoming role in the competition. And Glenn even goes one step further by also encouraging his student to give it her all, which greatly inspires her. But after she leaves, Glenn remains transformed as Rumia when he's suddenly approached by Sistine, who mistakes him for the real Rumia and kindly offers him some food. And although Glenn tries to resist the urge of stealing Rumia's lunch, he ultimately reaches in for a bite, just as the real Rumia appears, prompting Sistine to immediately use magic to reveal Glenn, before sending him flying with a powerful spell. Glenn lands elsewhere moments later, and as he struggles to regain his bearings, Rumia finds him and gives him some food that Sistine had secretly prepared just for him, which Glenn doesn't hesitate to absolutely devour. Suddenly, however, Queen Alicia approaches them, catching Glenn and Rumia completely by surprise. The Queen then apologizes to Glenn for his expulsion from the Special Ops Forces despite all his hard work, but Glenn responds that he only retired because he felt lazy. Suddenly, the Queen's eyes soften as she notices her daughter Rumia standing silently nearby. Unable to keep her feelings hidden any longer, she expresses her longing to reunite with her daughter. However, knowing that her mother abandoned her, Rumia refuses to acknowledge the Queen as her mother. And although the Queen feels a deep sadness watching her daughter walk away, she understands Rumia's feelings. Once the Queen leaves, Glenn finds a heartbroken Rumia sitting under a tree, and with a heavy heart, Rumia reveals to him that she is actually an incarnated demon, a cursed and forbidden being born with a special power that could threaten the royal family's reputation, and believes she was abandoned by the Queen for the sake of the country. In the middle of their conversation, however, Imperial soldiers suddenly appear and accuse Rumia of conspiring to assassinate the Queen and declare that she is to be executed immediately for this crime, which shocks both Glenn and Rumia. But when Glenn demands to see evidence of this, the soldiers dismiss his request and strike him forcefully, knocking him unconscious. They then seize Rumia and tie her to a tree as they prepare for her execution. But at that same time, Glenn regains consciousness and immediately rescues Rumia from certain death, before grabbing her in his arms and carrying her away with him. Elsewhere, Eleanor, one of the Queen's servants, reveals to Celica that she has placed a cursed collar around the Queen's neck, and warns that merely mentioning the curse will cost the Queen her life, putting both Celica and the Queen in a delicate spot. Meanwhile, Glenn and Rumia find refuge in a narrow alley where Glenn urgently contacts Celica for help, but she informs him that she can't help them at all and instead urges him to find a way to reach the Queen before it's too late. Suddenly, Riel appears out of nowhere and launches an attack at Glenn that nearly kills him and destroys most of the alleyway. But just as she leaps forward to attack again, Albert quickly intervenes and stops her as he knows that Glenn is innocent. And although Riel and Albert still want to share some words with Glenn, the gang decides to work together instead since they have the common goal of saving the Queen. And thankfully for them, Glenn has devised a genius plan. Meanwhile, Glenn's students gradually lose their edge in the competition, and their confidence wanes more and more with each defeat. Suddenly, however, Albert and Riel show up as replacements for Glenn, and promise to lead the class to victory in place of their old colleague. And although the class is skeptical to go along with these strangers, they eventually agree once Sistine points out how smug and annoying Glenn will be if they lose because he wasn't there to help them. And with the support of Albert and Riel, it doesn't take long for the students to regain their confidence, and once again go up in the ranks as they win competition after competition. Meanwhile, Glenn and Rumia continue to be chased by highly trained Imperial soldiers, while desperately trying to find a way to get to the Queen. Once it's then Sistine's turn to compete in the final event, she thinks back to Glenn's words of encouragement, and finds the strength to once again employ her high-level Tempest magic, which effortlessly wins her the match as the crowd erupts in cheers. And with this hard-earned victory, Glenn's class surpasses Hallie's class in points and are crowned the winners of the competition. And according to the rules, representatives of the winning team are given the rare opportunity to approach the queen. Just then, Albert and Riel step forward and stand in front of the queen, as they dispel the illusion and reveal themselves to have been Glenn and Rumia all along, while Albert and Riel were pretending to be them. Seizing the moment, Glenn urgently asks Alicia to order an end to all the chaos. And although his plea is heartfelt, the queen refuses and instead orders Rumia's execution. The weight of the queen's words immediately crushes Rumia's spirit as she falls into deep sadness. Glenn wonders what is happening, confusion clouding his mind, when he suddenly remembers that 3 years ago the queen tearfully begged him to protect her daughter. And just as he recalls this poignant memory, he realizes that the queen in her right mind would never give such an order, and immediately rushes towards the queen, but is easily intercepted. However, the queen uses this distraction to throw the collar away, freeing her of its curse before it could kill her thanks to Glenn's fool arcana. Queen Alicia then embraces her daughter tightly as tears stream down both their faces, while the queen expresses deep regret for once again hurting her. At the end of the day, Albert and Riel reunite with Glenn to thank him for his invaluable assistance, but Riel playfully threatens to someday come back for his head. Afterwards, Glenn and Rumia arrive at the fancy restaurant where the rest of the students are celebrating, and are shocked to find Sistine completely drunk, along with the other students too. But what's even more shocking is when Glenn receives the bill and realizes that it's more than every dime he made from the competition, bringing him right back to being completely broke. Sometime later, Sistine pleads with Glenn to help enhance her abilities as she desperately wants to protect Rumia from any future harm. And although Glenn agrees, he warns her about the rigorous path ahead and the dangers of pursuing greater power, but he also reassures her that he believes she can wield such power wisely. The next day at school, Riel suddenly appears out of nowhere and immediately greets Glenn with a sword strike, which is basically just tradition at this point. But what surprises Glenn the most is seeing Riel dressed in the academy uniform, a sight he never expected, as he quickly deduces that Riel must have been assigned to a covert operation aimed at protecting Rumia from potential threats. Later, Glenn takes Riel to the classroom and asks her to introduce herself to her new classmates, and to his surprise, Riel just casually reveals her identity as a member of the Imperial Army Special Ops Forces and immediately blows her cover like an idiot. But after Glenn whispers to correct herself, Riel quickly amends her statement by explaining that her dream is actually to become part of the Imperial Army someday. Sometime later, Glenn and his students embark on a trip to an alchemy research laboratory, and although the kids initially show little enthusiasm, Glenn decides to lift their spirits by casually mentioning that the ocean is nearby, which immediately shifts the mood as they imagine the plot-filled opportunity to see the girls in their swimsuits, which even Glenn can't deny wanting to see. And later that night, the mischievous boys begin planning a strategy to sneak into the girls' room to see their bakeries, but are caught by Glenn just as they are finalizing their plans, who immediately shuts down their plot-seeking mission, though he secretly finds their ideas amusing. Meanwhile, Riel observes Glenn and is surprised to see him so happy and relaxed, since she had only known him as someone mysterious and gloomy during his time in the Special Ops. As the night continues, the girls invite Riel to the beach to admire the beautiful starry sky. And as they start playing, Riel begins to feel comfortable around them, enjoying the company of the girls who now consider her a friend. Meanwhile, Glenn watches them satisfied as he witnesses the camaraderie developing among his students. But when Glenn is on his way back to the inn, Riel approaches him and asks why he left the Special Ops. In response, Glenn admits that he feels a bit guilty for leaving so suddenly, but before he can finish explaining, Riel's eyes fill with emotion as she confesses that her life has no meaning without him. However, Glenn responds that he has found joy in his new role as a teacher thanks to his students, and suggests that Riel consider officially becoming a student there too. But when Riel hears this, she immediately becomes angry and tells him that all she ever wanted was to be by his side, and hates him for letting Sistine and Rumia get between them. Glenn tries to explain his side of things, but Riel's hurt and anger create a wall between them and his words can't seem to reach her. Meanwhile, Eleanor is seen talking with a mysterious man about the progress of their plan, hinting at the larger schemes unfolding behind the scenes. The next day, as they head to the alchemy research laboratory, Sistine and Rumia notice Riel stumbling, and immediately try to approach and help her, but she violently rejects their assistance, shouting that she hates everyone before storming off, leaving the others in complete shock. When the students then finally arrive at the lab moments later, they are taken to a room where they see the results of experiments done using plants and animals to create chimeras, a sight which saddens Rumia. Shortly after, Burks, the lab's director, explains that their research known as the Revive Life Project seeks to bring people back to life through alchemy, which is believed to be impossible. Later that day, the girls invite Riel to eat with them, hoping to mend fences, but she's still angry and refuses to join them, and immediately runs away while trying to hold back her tears. Moments later, a strange man suddenly approaches Riel claiming to be her brother. Meanwhile, Albert, spying through his magical eye, recognizes the deception and immediately attempts to intervene, but is suddenly stopped by Eleanor appearing before him. However, he doesn't back down and counterattacks with relentless determination. Meanwhile, Riel is shocked to be face to face with her supposed brother. He tells her that he miraculously survived but needs her help to save him. He then deceitfully adds that they need to find Rumia as she possesses a power vital to him, and insinuates that Glenn is an obstacle to their mission, planting seeds of doubt in Riel's mind. And as she struggles with her emotions, she is swayed by the imposter's words. When Glenn then arrives shortly after, Riel suddenly stabs him with her sword, declaring she will now live solely for her brother's sake. At that same time, amidst the chaos, Albert realizes that Glenn has been taken down, and Eleanor, upon seeing that their plan has succeeded, abandons her fight with Albert and immediately retreats. Elsewhere, Sistine returns to the inn, where she suddenly hears the sound of shattered glass and rushes towards it, arriving just in time to find Riel with a blood-covered Rumia. And upon seeing this, Sistine is immediately paralyzed by fear, allowing Riel to escape with Rumia. Albert arrives moments later, carrying Glenn in critical condition, and urgently asks Sistine to lend her power for a white magic ritual to save him, as it requires a large amount of mana. But when Albert notices that Glenn has stopped breathing, he instructs Sistine to give him mouth-to-mouth while he initiates the ritual, and both Albert and Sistine work frantically to save Glenn's life. A few days later, Glenn finally wakes up and finds Sistine sleeping peacefully next to him. But his gentle morning is quickly ruined when he learns that Rumia has been kidnapped, and anger surges through him. Glenn immediately confronts Albert and blames him and his superiors for using Rumia as bait. And although their argument is filled with sharp words, they ultimately calm down as they both resolve to rescue Rumia and Riel no matter what. Meanwhile, the lab director Burks finds himself with Eleanor and Riel's fake brother, and it becomes clear that he played a key role in the kidnapping, as they plan to extract magic from Rumia's body in order to complete the Revive Life project. At that same time, Albert reveals that he had cleverly implanted tracking magic in Eleanor, allowing the group to quickly locate Rumia's location. Upon arriving there, Burks immediately commands his chimeras to attack Glenn and Albert. But just as the chimeras lunge forward, Glenn and Albert work together like they used to in the past, to effortlessly defeat the chimeras. Frustrated and seething with anger, Burks decides to intervene directly, intending to eliminate them himself. He then transforms into a giant, grotesque creature with a towering and monstrous form. Upon seeing this, Albert immediately urges Glenn to go and find Rumia, while he stays behind to confront Burks in his terrifying new form. When Glenn finally arrives where Rumia is held captive, he finds himself face to face with Riel and her fake brother and immediately tries to talk some sense into Riel. And although he speaks earnestly, she refuses to believe him and starts attacking Glenn with fierce determination. In response, Glenn has no choice but to fight back. But while doing so, he asks Riel the name of her brother, hoping to sow doubt in her mind about the man claiming to be her brother. Suddenly, Riel starts to experience a mental collapse as she struggles to remember her brother's name. Glenn takes advantage of this moment of vulnerability to strike her with his gun, immobilizing her with caveman-level magic. Meanwhile, Riel begins to remember how she is actually an artificial human, created by using the DNA of a scientist's younger sister as part of the Revive Life project, also known as Project Riel. But when this scientist had second thoughts about the project, he pleaded with Rainer, his co-worker, to abandon the project. But Rainer killed him and his sister instead. And moments later, Glenn arrived at the laboratory, only to find the clone named Riel in a containment vessel. And ever since that fateful day, he chose to be responsible for Riel, despite her artificial origin and the haunting memories of her past. Back in the present, it becomes evident that the person who posed as Riel's brother is none other than Rainer, who has still not given up on the Revive Life project. And as the tension mounts, Rainer suddenly orders emotionless clones to kill Glenn and Riel. But when one of the clones attempts to kill Riel, Glenn immediately rushes to save her without hesitation. And by seeing him fight so valiantly to protect her, Riel finds a surge of strength within herself and gets up to fight by his side. And together, they battle fiercely and ultimately defeat the clones. Glenn then points his gun at Rainer's head, but instead delivers a solid punch to Rainer's face. And at the same time, Albert manages to defeat Burks using his powerful fire magic. Afterwards, Glenn returns to the girls and Sistine is relieved to see that everyone is safe and sound. The next day, Glenn and Albert relax at the beach after their most recent crazy adventure, and revel in the breathtaking views of women in swimsuits laughing and playing in the sand with their plot bouncing around like yo-yos. Later that same night, Sistine brings Riel to her house, where she meets the warm and welcoming Fieble family. They immediately notice Riel's timid demeanor, but the kindness of the Fiebles slowly puts Riel at ease. Afterwards, the girls decide to head up to the rooftop, where Riel seizes the moment to apologize to them with heartfelt sincerity for losing sight of herself and betraying her precious friends. The next day, Glenn quietly approaches Sistine while she's studying in the library and asks her if she had a hand in the ritual that saved his life when he was on the brink of death. And with gratitude in his voice, he thanks her sincerely. But in that moment, Sistine recalls the memory of giving him mouth to mouth and becomes completely flustered. Just then, Rumia and Riel burst onto the scene, and upon seeing Sistine's flustered expression, immediately assume Glenn did something indecent to her, prompting Riel to immediately draw her sword, while Glenn has no choice but to run for his life while shouting that it's all a misunderstanding. But as he tumbles outside, he suddenly rolls in front of a carriage, and the driver casually flicks his hand to push Glenn aside with magic. The man then introduces himself with a commanding presence as Leo's, a guest instructor at the academy, who also reveals himself to be Sistine's fiancé, leaving everyone in stunned silence, as Leo's reminisces about a childhood promise Sistine and him made to marry when they grew up, unlocking a flood of long-forgotten memories for Sistine. Later that same day, we see Leo's confidently leading Glenn's class as a guest instructor. He teaches masterfully, and his knowledge and poise impresses all the students in the class, which understandably just annoys Glenn. Afterwards, Leo's invites Sistine for a walk outside, and as they stroll through the garden, he suddenly proposes to her while the others observe them in secret. However, Sistine rejects Leo's proposal because she wants to fulfill her grandfather's dying wish of reaching the castle in the sky. But upon hearing this, Leo's dismisses her dream and tells her to forget about it since it's just nonsense, which deeply disappoints Sistine, who feels that Leo's doesn't respect her aspirations. Just then, Glenn steps in and accuses Leo's of being selfish, but Leo's just tells him not to interfere in his affairs. At that moment, Sistine sees an opportunity to get away from Leo's by pretending that Glenn is her boyfriend, and Glenn, sensing her plan, plays along by nonchalantly hugging her while joking that they had a great time together the night before. Sistine of course kicks him away in response, while also accidentally revealing that all they did was kiss, which actually just angers Leo's even more as he declares Glenn his mortal enemy. Glenn, however, remains unfazed by this and casually challenges Leo's to a duel between his class and Leo's, the winner of which will get to marry Sistine. Later that night, Glenn meets up with Albert, who suggests that Glenn shouldn't compete for a girl he's not in love with. But Glenn barely pays attention and instead asks why Albert contacted him. Albert then reveals that a drug called Angel's Powder is being smuggled into the capital, which surprises Glenn as he thought it had been eradicated. On his way home afterwards, Glenn's mind drifts to memories of his past with Sarah, a woman who he realizes was very similar to Sistine in many ways. Meanwhile, at that same time, Leo speaks to a mysterious man, informing him that the plan went as expected. The next morning, all the students gather in the field in anticipation for the duel between Leo's and Glenn, and when the match begins, chaos immediately ensues. Leo's class utilizes high-level military tactics, which Leo's was surprisingly able to teach them in a short time, granting them a quick upper hand. However, Glenn's class doesn't lag far behind, and soon starts fighting on par with their opponents thanks to the tactics Glenn taught them. Glenn even suddenly begins to taunt the opposing team, and uses this sneaky tactic to lure them into the trap he had set up, ensnaring the unsuspecting boys, who are immediately met with Glenn taunting and mocking them even more. But when the intense fight finally comes to an end due to the time running out, the match is declared a tie. Despite this, Glenn stands proudly knowing his pupils have competed at the level of Leo's class, while Leo's is not satisfied with the outcome and sternly reprimands his class for failing him. Leo's then challenges Glenn to a one-on-one battle, as he refuses to lose Sistine to Glenn. In response, however, Glenn declares that he also won't give up his chance to marry Sistine since she's rich, which immediately angers her, and she slaps Glenn hard before leaving, as she feels she is being treated like an object by both men. Later that day, Rumia tells Sistine that although Glenn has his flaws, he wouldn't actually marry someone for their money, and urges her to clear up the misunderstanding with him directly. As night falls, Glenn heads to a secluded place where he reflects upon his time with Sarah. But as he sits quietly lost in thought, Sistine suddenly approaches him and overhears him murmuring Sarah's name. With curiosity and concern, she asks about Sarah, and Glenn begins to recount his story, describing the tale of a foolish boy who decided to study magic because he dreamt of becoming a hero for justice. But after spilling so much blood and seeing the horrors of war, he started to hate himself and decided to give up on magic. But that's when he met Sarah, who always stood by his side and encouraged him to continue pursuing his dreams. Glenn's voice then falters as he tells Sistine how, after Sarah was killed, he felt that his life had no purpose anymore, and he began to once again despise magic, which makes Sistine begin to understand the depth of Glenn's pain, and the reasons behind many of his actions. Sistine then thanks him with a precious smile that, to Glenn, resembles Sarah's. Suddenly, Leos appears seemingly out of nowhere and begins taunting Glenn by calling him a disgusting cold-blooded killer, unworthy of being a teacher. Angered by these words, Glenn decides to challenge Leos right then and there. But as soon as Leos agrees to fight, he immediately uses an alchemy-based technique to bring forth imaginary creatures into reality, turning them into formidable weapons that he uses without hesitation to attack Glenn. Meanwhile, Glenn tries to counter with his Fool's Arcana, but it proves ineffective since Leos is using alchemy rather than magic, and Glenn is completely overwhelmed by the creatures relentlessly attacking him. And moments later, Glenn finds himself beaten badly, with the duel lost, his body and spirit bruised, and Sistine horrified. And after being defeated, Glenn leaves in disgrace. A concerned Sistine tries to follow him, but Leos steps in and blocks her path, and in a cold and menacing voice, threatens to also harm Rumia and Riel if Sistine doesn't agree to marry him. Meanwhile, Glenn disappears, without returning to the academy for several days in a row, leaving his friends and students in a state of worry and uncertainty. And to make matters worse, Sistine painfully informs them that she has accepted Leo's marriage proposal, and reveals that their wedding will take place later that day. And although it is clear her heart is not in it, the wedding ceremony still goes on as normal, while Leos revels in his plan inching closer to fruition. But just as the wedding is about to conclude, Glenn suddenly bursts in and interrupts the proceedings to swiftly take Sistine away, completely shocking everyone. Glenn then justifies his prolonged absence by explaining that he was busy preparing for a confrontation with Leos. But just then, their conversation is cut short as a horde of Angel's powder addicts suddenly appears. And at that same time, Rumia and her classmates, who are still within the church, face imminent danger from other infected individuals. Meanwhile, Glenn summons his incredible power and confronts the Angel powder zombies head-on. But as Sistine observes this display of terrifying strength, she can't help but feel frightened by Glenn's power. Shortly after, Leos appears before Glenn and insists on clapping his cheeks again. Glenn, however, reveals that he's discovered that Leo's true identity is actually Jadis, a former member of the Imperial Army's Special Ops Forces. And without denying it, Jadis immediately changes to his true appearance. Jadis then reveals that his real desire is to find the Akashic Records in order to obtain supreme power and dominate the world. Tired of hearing him rabble on, Glenn takes initiative, and a fierce battle between the two ensues. And as the fight progresses, Glenn finds himself in a tight spot as Jadis relentlessly attacks him. But when he is pushed to his limits, Sistine suddenly appears to assist him and passionately tells him that, just like Rumia, he is very precious to her, as she implores him to give it his all so he can stay with them forever. Encouraged by her heartfelt words, Glenn regains his courage and stands up to continue the fight. Just then, Glenn finds an opening with the help of Sistine and seizes the opportunity to deliver one powerful final blow, which defeats Jadis once and for all, swiftly ending the fight with Glenn the victor. But despite their best efforts, Jadis still manages to narrowly escape, while ominously promising to one day meet Glenn again. And after the end of this very typical wedding, Glenn carries Sistine on his back, and is met with Rumia and the rest of the students who are relieved to see them safe and sound. And as life returns to normal in the following days, Glenn is filled with a renewed sense of purpose in life by finally embracing his new dream, to become a dignified teacher who can inspire the next generation of magic users. Thanks for watching Recap Sensei as always. Make sure to check out my other content and don't forget to subscribe. See you all again in my next videos.